Okay, so recently a member made a comment about the trend power indicator and how when it gets to a certain level it normally goes to a higher level. So what I mean by that is, say you can see down here the trend power indicator, and say it gets to 15, it might get to 20 or 30, and that was an observation that I sort of questioned and thought I would do a video on how I would go about looking at that. So you can see that this is just the Bund, and this is the trade plan that I'm going to be using to analyze that. And the reason is that all the settings are the same each week. The only thing that varies is the range. Roughly speaking, the average of the range over recent times is a 4-tick bar, so that's good as well. We can leave it at that for the minute. So first things first, what you need to do is you'll need to take the data out of TradeStation and get it into Excel. And to do this, what you will need to do is get up your data window and right click on the data window and click Save, and you can get a text file and then import this data directly into Excel. And this is the imported data that I've already formatted. Now the values that you need to get to compare the data and the trend power extremes are the extreme values in each swing. So you can see here in column I, I've already created a vertical representation of the indicator. So you can see that in this first swing high, 1762 was the high, and what I'm going to do is just highlight that, and then the low there was of the first swing down was 12.10, negative 12.10. The high in this swing, it was a bigger swing, stayed positive for longer, was actually here at 37.62. And so that's just something to go on to start with. Now I'm not going to go through all the formatting, as I have done some of that in previous videos, but basically what you need to do to be able to analyze this, and it may be able to be done in a different way, but this is the way I did it, is to group each time it turns from positive to negative. And what I did there is I created this TP pos and TP neg, so trend power positive, trend power negative, a 1 for if it's true, a 0 for if it's false, and well, actually sorry, a number for if it's true and a 0 for if it's false. And that's the grouping. And so for the first two I put 1s for positive and 0s for negative, and vice versa for the for where trend power goes negative. Now when it turns again, basically I've created this formula, and I'll just let you look at that for a little bit, and it's basically saying if, for the positive column, if the new trend power value is greater than 0, if that statement is not true, put a 0 in, because it's not positive. If it is true, do another if statement and check if the last cell was less than or equal to 0. And if it was less than or equal to 0, then you want to check what the maximum value of always, this you can see $W, $2, although you just need the dollar on the 2 to lock it down to that, so when I copy it down it's always retaining that W2 value to the last cell there, which, so it's basically looking at this range here and checking what the highest value is, and then adding 1, so it's creating a new range. If the last cell is not less than or equal to 0, i.e. it's also positive, then it's within the same swing, and so you just put the same value for the last cell, so in this case W12, and you can see that that copies down and it goes W2, W13, W2, W14, etc. So for the negative column, what you're looking for is basically the same as the positive column, but you're going to be reversing the signs. So if you can see up here, it's looking at what this cell is. So I13, is it less than 0? If it is, then you do one thing. If it's not, then you put in a 0. In this case, you can see that there's 0 because it's a positive swing. So if it were less than 0, then you would check if the last cell was greater than or equal to 0, and if it was not, then you would just put in the last value, so it would be within the same negative swing of the trend power, and you could just call it the same group number. If it is, then you would look at the maximum value again of what's come prior to it, and then add a 1. So you're basically incrementally increasing the group number. And the reason I've done this is that what I can then do is create a pivot table, and each pivot table, I've created 2 separate pivot tables, and I want the maximum number of the up trend power value and the minimum value of the downward trend power value. So all I've done to do that is clicked on the Insert tab and then Pivot Table, selected the data from the data worksheet and dragged in my group number. So that was this W column for the positive and X column for the negative, and then dragged in the trend power number and changed it to the max. So we can see before the first 2 highlighted cells, just to show you that it did get the correct values, were 1762 and 3762 for positive. You can see that that's right there, and there was a negative 12.1 for the minimum value of the first push lower in trend power. So I've then gone on and added these values into a column, all into one column, so that I can then do a histogram, and that's been done using just the, if you go onto the data tab, if you've set it up already, you can go onto the data analysis and create a histogram by using that column, and it will, you need to have like a bin, so which numbers you want it to check against, and this would basically be the bin. So I've done a positive and negative histogram, and I've also done an absolute value, so all the negative values I've made into positive values, so you can just see the extent of any oscillation around 0. So returning to the question of whether if it gets to a certain value it then frequently goes beyond that, there are 2 ways of looking at this. The first way is that before a trend power change happens before it goes from negative to positive or vice versa. You can see based on the frequency of trend power values, what the likelihood is that that will end up being the extreme. So if you've currently you have a negative trend power number, then it's turning positive actually up to 12, up to a value of 12 is 37.12% of the data that I've got here. So the likelihood is pretty low that that's going to be the extreme of that positive push in trend power. And then you can see it gets more and more as you go up. So I've done blocks here just to illustrate it a bit more more clearly, but you know, you can do it by the actual value exactly as well. So up to this point it's got to 62.44, so 62.44% of the time in the data that we've got, positive trend power pushes are up to a value of 24 for the setting that I have on the Bund trade plan. And obviously this is going to vary depending on the trade plan and the setting that you have on trend power. So the other way to look at it is that you say, okay, it's got to, and this really comes back to the question, the original comment by the member, and it's got to a particular number, particular value. Say it's got to maybe 20, and you think, well, what's the likelihood that it's going to continue? And so you can see that I've done this percentage after column. So if it gets to positive 20, there's actually a 91.1% probability that it will go further. Now that's not to say that it's going to go to 22 or it's going to go to 40, but what it's saying is that if you look at the data, so 20 at 20 actually, trend power 20, frequency 20, and that's 19 or 20 because I've done it in 2-point increments. But at that point, the total of what's remaining here is 225. So it could go from 20, it could carry on all the way up to 50. And there's only 20 occasions where 20 has been where it stopped. 19 or 20 is where it stopped. And so that's where we get the 91.1%. And you can look at it, okay, if it gets to 20, what's the percentage of the time that it goes another 10 points? So the values that are 10 points and beyond, you can see that would be from here onwards. So what we just need to do is do equals sum of these numbers over the sum of all those numbers. And that's roughly about 63% of the time. So by doing this, you can see that virtually always there's a chance of it going further beyond the value that it currently stands at. And I hope that you enjoyed the video.